Discover how smarter project insights can lead to better project outcomes.
Hello, project people. A very warm welcome to our new episode of the Project Chatter podcast. It's great to have you back. Remember to hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast player and YouTube if you'd like to see our bloopers. Thanks, Martin. And our very friendly faces. Dale, how you been, buddy? Long time no see.
Yeah, it's been a while. I've been great. Not too much happening. We had a mini heat wave, which has been fantastic. I know. But you got to celebrate these things in the UK. It's a rarity. And I think it's the last bit of sunshine we'll have for the year. But it is September, so we got to count our blessings. It is getting darker earlier, which is strange as well. But I'm sure Martin is happy that this sort of mini heat wave is over, because Martin, we spoke about before that you suffer, factor 50 whenever the sun's out. How do you feel about this?
I'm glad it's over now. It was just back to being indoors all the time. A bit like Val, actually.
Yeah, so, with the bunny. Awesome.
All good.
Well, look, let's get our guest in here because, we talk all day. But very warm welcome. And we're joined by Sarah Schutte. Hopefully I got that right today. How are you?
Hi guys. Yeah, really well. Thank you very much. I've actually quite enjoyed the heat wave despite being a redhead, but I am slightly happier now. It's a tad cooler.
Yeah, no, that's great. And look, this is the first time we've really, isn't it, Dale, that we've really talked about kind of law in construction and engineering. And I'm pretty fascinated by it, actually, because we've kind of dissected a lot of other subjects over the last year. So thank you for being the very first guest to talk about this.
Wow, gosh.
Where should we start, Sarah? Should we start with the origin story? How do you get into law? Because I remember I did one subject in law and I almost fell asleep. And it was the most driest, boringest. Oh no, wait, no, it wasn't. It was corporate governance, but it had law in it, and it was terrible. But how did you get into law? Where does it start for you?
Oh my goodness, it probably starts around about the slightly nerdy age of about 14 or 15, and genuinely being really interested in what was going on, being an avid reader, following politics. I remember I used to lie on the floor for the whole of Sunday afternoon reading all of the papers from cover to cover. I don't know where I found the time to do that. I've got an 11-year-old who's, just started secondary school, and she's kind of starting to manage her time as well. And it really took me back to thinking about, where do you take your life? What do you want to do? But I genuinely was really, really interested in law. I had a couple of outlets through a great uncle of mine. It's always handy to get that sort of leg up to get a bit of experience. And I was really lucky at the age of 16, 17 to be able to go and do a bit of summer holiday work with him, but basically just trailing around afterwards, carrying papers and stuff. But, that gave me a real insight into what it was like to be doing law as it happened in London, which is where I am now, but that isn't where I started. And then going out and doing lots of different other work experiences through the medium of school, then through university and all of that. And I chose law at university. I did a pure LLB, Bachelor's of Laws. To be honest, I did really throw myself into it. I won't say I was a super duper student, and I probably also fell asleep from time to time. But I really picked myself up, and I got really interested in some of the specialist modules that I was able to choose. Some of the really basic stuff is flipping boring, but you've got to nail it and you've got to get it right in order to then be able to go and choose some of the more nuanced stuff like corporate governance. Like in my case, I did medical law. Really enjoyed that one. I did a specialist module on child and family law. Actually won the blinking university prize for it as well. And here I am firmly ensconced in the corporate world. So, somewhere along the way, all of that stuff just kind of came together. And the rest of it, as they say, is history. But I have had quite an interesting career insofar as it's been tripartite, having been in private practice and also as an in-house counsel, and also for the last few years running my own legal consultancy. So I do wear that badge with pride, and the variety of experience, I hope, has really lent itself now as I enter my 20th year of practice to having a really kind of well-rounded experience, albeit quite specialist in the niche of construction and engineering.
Wow, that is amazing, Sarah. I'm sure the listeners are listening with intrigue and going, okay, so where do projects fit into all of this then? Why are you on the Project Chatter podcast? Well, I think there's many places it fits in, having spoken to you before, and also, having a look at your bio. But I wonder if you wanted to fill them in as to sort of your experiences on projects, and then we can kind of go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was a trainee lawyer, a typical thing that trainees have to do is you have to go and sit in what's called a seat. It's basically a department, fancy words, legal people and all that. And the firm that I was with had 4 of those seats. I did insurance for the first one. I did corporate, specifically health and safety and regulation for the second one. Then I did construction and engineering. Oh, no, I didn't. I did commercial litigation for the third one. And then my fourth one was construction and engineering. And I was super lucky because I realized that I could bring, perhaps not so much the medical thing, although there's elements because I've done inquests and things like that, all of those 4 things together in the world of projects. And I really, really took to engineering. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a scientist. I did get good GCSEs in science, but I firmly went down the path of arts and mathematics for my A levels, and then as I said, I did this pure law degree. But I found something in that final seat that I did in construction and engineering. I was working with a QS turned solicitor. So he had a really interesting angle on having come to the profession late as a second career. And I kind of worked out that having that blend of all the experience I'd had in the other seats really lent itself to working in the world of projects. And I've been, so lucky to have worked on so many interesting things, ever since that. So it all really just kind of magically came together at the end. Life has a lot of luck in it. My granddad used to say that to me all the time. You do have to work hard for sure, especially in law. It is really competitive, but you do need, a helping hand and a stroke of luck at the same time. And then once you've been given those, you've got to grab them and roll with it. And I did.
No, that's interesting. And, so you mentioned health and safety, but I also know you've done quite a bit of contract law as well. And the health and safety one is obviously quite intriguing, and we'll get into some of the interesting stories and your views around those. But I think the contract law angle would be particularly intriguing in terms of sharing your views on that. And now we do have this topic of making law work, right? So often, if you think about it, you don't think about the law on projects until you need to, until it's too late, potentially. So maybe this is a podcast that those listening in will go, well, maybe we should start thinking about the law before we have to think about it. So I wonder if contracts have such a huge impact these days on how projects are being delivered, around behaviors, culture. On the podcast, we talk about, the triple constraint: leadership, culture, behaviors, delivery, risk, the works, technology. Yet the foundation of all of that is that contractual relationship. And that can be administered in various different ways. And with the best intentions, NEC has, mutual respect and all that type thing. With the best intentions, that often doesn't happen. That's what, in myself, Martin, and Val's experience, at least, it often doesn't happen. And so I wonder then, from your view and what you've seen, are there tips, hints, angle, stories that those listening could go, okay, how can we get to a place where we don't have to rely on the contract necessarily? It's just something we need when we need it, but actually we should be able to collaborate without it, or potentially going, well, we should stay on side. I don't know where to start with this. I'm just going to hand to you. There's many questions and many rabbit holes, as we said.
Gosh, there is so much. You're absolutely right. And I have to say, every single one of those things that you have mentioned comes together, depends upon and impacts on and through a contract. And that is, the nub of it. My job is done when people understand what the contracts are all about, because the contract is your framework. It's your relationship foundation, but it is also the means, the vehicle. It can be documentation, it can be an oral contract, but it is the means by which the parties' relationship is regulated, and it's regulated through agreement. Now, there are other regulations that sit around the edge, legal stuff like don't steal from your neighbor, obvious things like that. Don't put in a fraudulent application for payment, things like that, but those are norms, and they're societal norms in some ways. But the rest of it, we have this wonderful thing in common law, which is, of course, both foundation of law in South Africa and in Australia as well, and many other jurisdictions around the world. Common law has freedom of contract, and freedom of contract is a wonderful thing. It means you can agree anything you like, provided it is legal. And of course, that then comes back to laws and legislations and what is societal norms. But other than that, you can do what you like. So the contract is this wonderful opportunity for parties to projects to be able to build an agreement that suits their purpose. And this is one of the reasons why I wrote, and this took me a long time to write, the Making Law Work for the Construction and Engineering Industry, because that's really what we do. It's really where my personal passion is, and it's what I feel very strongly about. Contracts matter enormously. We don't pay enough attention to them. Lots of people don't have enough time and opportunity to pay attention to them. But really, ultimately, when push comes to shove, and a court or an adjudicator or an arbitrator is asked to look at the parties' relationships and to resolve and determine and make a decision which is going to bind those parties forever and a day, subject to an appeal court, the contract is where you're going to find out what the rules and regulations of that arrangement are, what the parties have agreed as between them. And it's going to be a relatively unusual situation where that tribunal, that court, arbitrator or adjudicator, is going to unpick that contract and say, no, we don't think this was any good. Actually, we're going to impose another set of rules and regulations on you. And we don't like the terms that you have agreed between you, because commercial parties have that freedom of contract, as do individuals, by the way, but the rules pertaining to individuals are slightly different. Where you've got two commercial parties coming together to do a project, it's going to be a very, very rare occasion indeed when the contract is going to be pulled apart in such a way that the terms are not going to be binding on the parties. So it's absolutely fundamental that parties take time to properly negotiate the arrangements that they want to make that are going to bind them to each other for what could be quite a long period of time, and to have residual rights and obligations, liabilities, duties, and all sorts of other potential things. I mean, when we get into really complex projects and we talk about indemnities, we talk about cross claims and undertakings and all sorts of really difficult contract law stuff, but which has huge amounts of risk, financial, reputational, impact risk attached to it, investor risk, ESG, when you get onto all of that side of things as well, then you really start to understand why the contract matters so much. So, Val, I hope it wasn't contract law that you fell asleep in. If it was, come and join my series on contract law for APM, which I am in the middle of doing at the moment. And you'd be very welcome to catch up on webinar 1. And the live webinar second one is next week. And the third one is in November. So you haven't missed too much.
I would love to take you up on that offer. And honestly, if it was you that was delivering the training, maybe I wouldn't have fallen asleep in the first place, because I am interested. This is interesting now. So it's piqued my interest. And I had some questions around, and I love the idea of freedom of contract. And I think that's great that you can set your own clauses. And, sometimes it gets a bit carried away, the old Z clause, and there's about 50 pages of that.
Well,
but
that's a discussion we'll come to, I'm sure. Freedom of contract has been around since the Magna Carta, since it was written down. And of course, it's existed before then, because people have always had what we call civil dealings. It's very basic, buy, sell. You've got something I want. What can I give you in return? It's super simple. And contracts can be as simple as that. But of course, they can be hugely complex as well. But yeah, we'll get into Zeds, I'm sure.
Agree. And I was just taken back. Dale and I have met a lot of, evangelists in the project management suite, right? Who talk about project delivery. They talk about project improvement. They talk about project efficiency. We've had Six Sigma guys on. We've had... we're looking at project at all different angles, and we're super curious, and I know Martin is as well. what we don't know is why isn't, and this is just a curiosity, I don't know why, but if you look at, take PMBOK or any other methodology that is a certification for project managers, there is nothing in there. Even though the triple constraint's real, let's say that's the outcome, right? It costs quality, time, and scope. If you want to get that sorted out, you need to have, the body of knowledge, which is 12 knowledge areas. Now, one of those knowledge areas is contract law. And I'm just wondering, what do you think about that? I mean, I think they've just completely missed probably the elephant in the room. If you think about it, it's probably one of the trickiest. It's one of the hardest. It's one of the ones that impacts projects the most. Yet no one gets taught it. What's your view on that?
Yes, I've been working with PMI as well as with APM for a number of years now. I am quite evangelical about contracts and the value of contracts to project managers, because as you rightly say, things like the PMBOK guide and even the APM's body of knowledge, although they've done a lot more work, I'm on the contract SIG, on this kind of topic, I suppose that there's a very short answer to the PMI point, which is that they are concerned mainly with what we call internal projects. They're not particularly concerned, and therefore don't teach an area of in the 12 areas, etc., to what we call external projects, which are projects that are outsourced for profit. I'm going to throw in here a reference to the Project Business Foundation, where I'm a member of the board, and I lead on the alternative dispute resolution and education and learning side of things as well. Oliver Lehmann, who you might know, is a very well-known project manager from Germany. He's been involved with PMI for many, many years and been kind of pushing this as a topic. And he and I came together completely separately and independently at a PMI conference a few years back, where I was up on the stage talking about this whole idea of why contracts are important to project managers, and he came over to me and said, I've been trying to do this for forever. And, and here we are 4 years later, and we've got this, this new not-for-profit going, and plenty of other people besides us involved. So yeah, contracts are hugely important, and it's a huge hole actually. And I think it's a real shame actually for project managers that it isn't a routine thing, because I think if things become routine, they become part of the psyche. It is part of what you do. It is a norm, if you like. It isn't a strange thing. So yeah, you can go on a course and learn some contract law, but again, this is one of the driving factors in my business. Okay, so what? I've learned a heap about contract law. I can tell you what an indemnity and an undertaking is and the difference between them and the circumstances in which they apply. But what the hell has that got to do with my project that's going on over here? So one of the things that we pride ourselves on here is translating that difficult stuff, that legal language, the sometimes garbage, to be honest, into clear language and into consistent terms and into things that people understand, because of course the whole world of projects is about certainty and risk, and getting the three pillars right, the quality, the cost and the time, and getting them all to come together such that you can deliver what is a successful project. And of course that depends on what you define as success. Then you do that through the medium of the contract. You set that foundation, you regulate that arrangement, you put some processes into place whereby people are going to regulate themselves, including their behaviors, including how they're going to measure stuff. And hey presto, you come out with project managers that are much more well-rounded, that are more capable, that are more competent. And of course, having the capability and additional competence to do your job as a project manager is actually one of the triangulated bits of PMI as well, which is all about leadership and business and being more than just the sort of technical project manager who can put a WBS together, look at a program, talk to people occasionally, and do a little report with a nice pretty graph. It's really important for project managers to be able to do all of those things. To do that, you've got to have a decent handle on contracts.
Yeah, and I recognize more now than ever that maybe that's the reason I got out of project management, because it's getting really hard. There's a lot of various fusion skills you need to adapt to. It's not just, like you said, it's great to be able to report where you are, and you've got to motivate the team, and you've got to keep contractors in line, and you've got to manage up, and you've got to negotiate with the client, and you've got to manage risks. There's a lot of various things in the air. I'm going to go to Martin now, because I know Martin's also interested in this space, and he's probably got some scenarios. Martin, what do you got?
So we talked about a few rabbit holes of commercial law earlier. Let's just dive straight into one.
Go on.
Can NEC3, 4, and things like earned value management ever exist in harmony? You got your EVM baselines, your last accepted programs, your application for payments, reported actuals. Can it work?
And you're asking one project manager to do all of that. I mean, it's so incredibly difficult, isn't it? NEC is actually a great example because the breadth of the project manager role, it is too much for any one man or woman to handle. And I'm honestly a firm believer that there is nobody out there who has that entire skill set. And I, it would be superhuman, to be honest. I like to look at active verbs in my contracts because they give me an idea of what I'm going to talk to my client about in terms of what they're going to have to do. And if you can peg what you're going to have to do, then you start to get a really good handle on the activity, which you're then going to translate into your workbook, into your critical path, into what you're going to measure for your own value and everything else. You've got to have a good handle on your doing verbs. And NEC, as we know, is stuffed full of doing verbs. And that's because it uses the simple present active tense in all but very few cases. And one of the interesting things, here's a rabbit hole, between NEC3 and NEC4 is that there has been a marked change in the drafting that has altered between the two versions as to the approach of the drafting. But just parking that for a minute, you're nodding, you've already recognized these or maybe talked to other people about them. Can the project manager do all of those things? Well, I think it's really impossible. You've got to have a bloody good planner on your team, for one thing, because of the centrality of the program in that particular form of contract. Loading on all of the other stuff through the scope and other things as well, is all laudable, is all useful stuff if it's useful, if it's reliable data and all the rest of it. But first of all, you've got to have a good handle on your basics, which is what is the arrangement that we have, and that is your contract. So we keep coming back round to that.
Yeah, no, you're right. I think the project manager hat is a multi-diverse hat, and they can't work without some of the support functions like project controls and PMO and various other support functions. But I also think, particularly on projectified projects, I've had a long kind of relationship with what they call mega projects now, and it just seems like every project that comes out just has to be mega because there's some type of pissing contest in the government, I'm sure. Mine's worth $1 billion, mine's 16, mine's 50 billion.
Of course.
What's going on here? So particularly in Australia, where we're going through what we call an industry boom in transport and infrastructure in particular, right? So construction engineering. And the fallback contract is PPP, private-public partnership, for those that don't know. And the challenge with them, and particularly PPP alliances, where you've got your three kind of parties. One of them is always the government. Just make sure you're doing the right thing. But they don't share anything. And what I'd wonder is, in these big projectified projects, why isn't someone with a contract law in that C-suite, in that kind of alliance directorship role? Now, you'll see everyone else there. In terms of seats at the table, there might be someone in commercial, but that doesn't necessarily do contract law. Is there a difference between commercial and contract people, or commercial and law people, or is it the same thing?
It's not the same thing in general, although there are plenty of competent commercial people who will have done a course or two in law, probably contract law, and therefore have a decent handle on contracts. And so they should, because crikey, it's their job. If you're a contract manager or a contract executive, it should be squarely at the forefront of what you know about. But it's not the same as being a contract lawyer in that sense. And you're right that there's an obvious hole, and I'm afraid that it's one of the areas where legal doesn't shout enough, and I noticed that very much in house, although that isn't to say that any of the places where I was in house suffered from that problem particularly greatly, but you do find legal is one of those parts of the business which gets consulted but sort of left from the party. And sort of, is asked for the recipe and makes the cake, and then somebody else takes the cake off and goes to the party with it, which is a lovely thing to be able to show. So we do a lot of background work as contract lawyers, but we don't often get to sort of credit ourselves about it. And that's okay, because actually I personally, I don't mind that at all. And as a lawyer, all the work you do is confidential anyway, so you're not going to get very much out of me in terms of any specifics, unless I really slip up. But you're right, even in those kind of alliancing scenarios where you've got multi-party contracts, and of course the government is there playing its bit, sort of playing its bit, but not really playing its partnering bit, because that's a very difficult thing that runs very deep, is to let go of being the one in charge. I am the one at the top. It's my project, it's my land, it's our asset, it's taxpayers' money, and there is a certain thing that goes with that. So to get into bed in an alliance way, which has a completely different structure to it, is really, really hard. But actually that's where legal can add huge amounts of value, because we do understand. I like to think I understand the very practical side because of that tripartite career that I've had. But of course, there are lots of lawyers who understand much more about the theory and the academic side of things. And that's why we get missed out from the top table, is because there aren't enough people, dare I say, like me, who can actually bring some of that real life stuff to the table and talk knowledgeably about projects that are in a non-theoretical, dull and boring legal way, because nobody wants to talk about that. We want to talk about how we get stuff done. And then again, making law work for industry is what we're all about. So we put contracts in place that help people to get stuff done, and enable project managers to know where they stand on risk, on certainty, and on clarity of terms. And of course, there's forms of contract like the NEC, which are a good starting point. And are helpful for regulating that relationship and setting it up. But again, it's all about how it's then moved into the delivery space, and how it's delivered in a practical sense, how those active verbs are then actually taken on, and people do what the contract says they're supposed to do. And of course, if they don't know what it is, because they haven't had access to the contract, they haven't been consulted about it, they haven't been able to participate in some of the terms that have been set, then how on earth can we expect project managers to be able to do what of course should be a superlative job in delivering maximum success to contracts, time, budget, quality every time? But we can't expect them to do that if we haven't given them the means and the ability to question, to contribute, etc., to the arrangements that have been put in place almost on their behalf, and then they're handed it and gone, off you go deliver this is going to be great, this asset thing, whatever it is we're going to build. Some shiny new boy's toy.
And I see that they've kind of treated I think law, at least in the projects I've worked on, as kind of like firefighters, that you only come in when the fire's raging, and sometimes then you don't really know what part of the building needs to be put out first. Is it the one with the screaming people, or is it the one where the Rolls Royce is sitting? It's a very interesting topic, and we can go down many rabbit holes. And I love the little nugget there that you said about active verbs. So if you're reading a contract, I think Martin's just nodded there as well.
That's my thing.
Yes,
that's my
active
copyright.
Verbs. Boom.
Yeah.
Is there a software that
absolutely.
does that? Is there anything out there that just picks the active verbs for you, and you read it like the Matrix? No.
I bet Microsoft
You
Word has got something in it that picks up a verb, because it can at least but I don't know. I can't say about any particular
anyone knows,
software.
get in touch with us, info@projectchatterpodcast.com. Dale, over to you.
Thanks. I love it. Sarah, I was wondering actually, when you were chatting, then you're saying, I'm not going to share any details unless I slip up. I was actually going to try and squeeze you for some interesting real life stories without naming anything or anyone.
We can do that.
But we'll get into that in a bit. But I wanted to first just rewind a little bit, because you spoke about, we have freedom of contract, which means we can basically agree to anything as long as it's legally binding. But I thought, is that...
No, as long as it's legal.
Sorry, as long as
it's legal, yeah.
As long as it's legal, sorry.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, is that perhaps part of the problem and the issue, because it's so loose?
Mm-hmm.
It reminded me, Val and I spoke to Martin Murphy, who's an Irishman, but been based in Spain for many years. And he's gone and done disputes, from a scheduling perspective, etc. And he said, well, in Spain, they don't really have a standard form of contract, because there's this general culturally accepted way of working on projects. They don't, the client doesn't even have project managers as an example. And so I thought, is there any sort of cultural, ethical, national identity view to the way we do contracts, perhaps in the UK? You mentioned Australia and South Africa as well. that has an impact on how they administer it, because surely if they weren't so cumbersome and we didn't concentrate so much on the contract to make profit, maybe we'd actually make more profit and progress.
Very interesting way of looking at it.
I don't know what your thoughts on that.
Well, I suppose your starting point with the comparator of Spain is a really interesting one, because of course Spain as a continental European country is, like many other countries of the world, subject to what is called a civil code. So you have less need for a contract in a way. You don't have common law. Common law is unwritten. It's a thing which has existed. It was part of it was written down in the Magna Carta, as I've said, but a lot of it is all about custom and practice. And that's where the freedom of contract subject to legality comes in. Other jurisdictions of the world have a lot more packed into their law. So their contracts are either a lot smaller, or as your colleague and friend has said, we just don't need this stuff because it's just part of how life is organized. But yeah, I think sometimes that is a hindrance to us, because it's almost overwhelming. It's like having too much choice at the sweet shop. You just don't know where to start. And that is actually where standard forms of contract can be incredibly useful, because they do give us that starter for 10. They give us that leg up. They give us some consistency within industry. They give familiarity within industry as well. You open up your tender pack if you're acting for a contractor, and what's the form of contract? Oh, it's this one. Oh yeah, we know that one. We can pull that one off the shelf, or draw it down from the internet or whatever. So they give us a really good starting point, and they do give some consistency and familiarity to people in industry who are working with them. So that's one good part of it. But yeah, otherwise, the fact that you can do what you like, subject to legality, can be problematic. In the construction engineering arena in the UK, of course, you've got the Housing Grants Act piece of legislation, which does ring fence and box in construction contracts to some extent. There is also similar legislation in other parts of the world. Ireland's only in the last couple of years adopted a similar adjudication type of provision. So you've got this specialist tribunal where you can send disputes as well. Hong Kong's been looking at it and doing something different. And I believe Australia and New Zealand have also got variants of a similar type of scheme, or at least that's, within governmental discussions and that. So there are some sort of borders. It isn't complete complete mayhem out there, and we don't have to start with blank sheets of paper. That's really important for project managers to know, that it isn't all on them. When we talk about all the active verbs that they have to do, particularly in forms of contract like NEC, it can be very overwhelming indeed. The last thing we need to do is to land project managers with just going, well, here's your blank sheet of paper, off you go, write the contract. So there are those of us who obviously deal with contracts day to day in terms of an expertise that we can lend support to, but also, the existence of standard forms, which are relatively tried and tested. I'm sure we're going to get onto Z courses soon. I can feel it. It gives us some of that framework, and shape and foundation as a starter for 10.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Z clauses in 2 questions time on my list. I wrote that down. But before we get there,
you want to go through all the other options first, before we get to Z, A, B, C.
Yeah, you know what? If we had Glenn Hyde on here, he'd probably recite it off by heart, every single clause and number and everything. We have had Glenn on before. We need to get him back, because at the time, I think, what was out 4, and he was busy writing 5 as well. And I don't know if it was quite done, but he was busy doing or being part of releasing 5. I can't remember, but we need to get Glenn back. I just wanted to ask you, I was intrigued as well around contract administrators, right, or legal teams. How technically skilled do they have to be in knowing the actual subject matter of what's being delivered, whether that's a software project or a civil project or oil and gas, etc., and how adaptable do they need to be, or is it enough just to understand the law?
It's not enough, in my humble opinion, if you want to have a value-added impact for your client, if you want to give them direction which is more than theoretical, if you want to give them guidance and a steer which is practical, which is commercially orientated, but which is firmly grounded in legal principles. So you have to, for sure, know all that legal stuff, because if you don't know your contract law, you didn't pass the module, you fell asleep in lecture, whatever it happens to be, so you've got to have that, foundation. I've always relished the challenge on my projects of learning something new from the technical side. I'm not going to be a cladding expert. I'm not going to be a scheduling and planning expert by any means, far, far, far from it. But I find it really helps me to do my job in advising, in drafting, in looking for rabbit holes, in looking for pitfalls, if I know something about what the subject matter is. And I guess over the years I've done quite a lot of different sorts of projects in a few different arenas, but I've also been able to really specialize in the infrastructure side, in particular the railway, not least because I spent 10 years doing in-house stuff for railway company. So to that extent, it's incumbent on you as an in-house lawyer to add value to your client, and to do that you have to get stuck into what other people are up to. The other benefit for me is gaining that trusted advisor role, and having people within a business who are naturally a little bit reticent to come to, who perhaps aren't really sure what you do, who've perhaps never had to deal with lawyers. When I worked for WSP, they'd never had any lawyers in the UK. I was the second or third lawyer to go in there. It was a very fledgling department in that sense. We had to go out, and I made it my business to go out to them and say, hey, what are you doing? I'm interested in this stuff. Don't look at me so suspiciously, honestly. And it takes time to build those relationships and that trust. But to do a good job as a contracts lawyer, if you know contract law, you can write a contract. But to write a contract that people can use, that people can take in their hands, that people can read and understand and deliver against with their technical knowledge, it's a really challenging and a real privilege to have a go at doing that, and to really kind of hone a skill, and be somebody who companies like to come to and say, hey, we've heard you're good at this stuff, can you help us with this? So yeah.
No, that's great. And we mentioned it a few times, Z clauses, you mentioned the different terms. I mentioned I wanted to squeeze some
Let's do this.
interesting stories out of you. Val's got a few questions lined up on this. My question around it was going to be hopefully something fun. What are some of the most quirky, interesting, weird terms, and perhaps Z clause as well, that you've seen, witnessed, that you just go, why the hell would you sign up to that? I wonder, just for entertainment value.
Just for entertainment value. Well, let me tell you that Z clauses and Z clauses is particular to the NEC contract, but what we call additional clauses of contract. So it is new drafting to a standard form of contract. So, we talk about the value of and the usefulness of standard forms of contract because they give familiarity, they give consistency, they give industry standard benchmark terms, etc., etc. As soon as you start changing them, sometimes I say messing with it, depends how feisty I'm feeling. Yeah, if you start messing about with those terms, then you can have unintended consequences, both in contract law, but also in the practicality then of how the contract is going to be delivered. Those can be good, those can be bad. Often they're badly drafted, which doesn't make for a happily sort of put together contract. The jigsaw doesn't work and all sorts of other stuff. But there are some really well drafted clauses that are just terrible, and useless to people and not at all helpful. And I get really cross about those. And one of the reasons I get cross about it, and I'm not one to very vocally criticize my own profession because it's not very ethical to do it, is just say, come on, people. But again, we come back round to your very valid question of, is it enough just to know contract law? And that's why I say no, is because I like to do drafting which is useful to people, which if it isn't, what's the point? You pay money for people to draft contracts for you. The least you can do is give them something which they can use. Otherwise, it's actually going to backfire. And for me, the education of project managers and contract managers is all around, let me help you to understand the contract, because actually it can be useful to you. You've probably come across some really crap ones in the past. They weren't drafted by me, but your future ones can be if you would like to engage us. But let me help you with the one you've got now, because that's the one that you've got to deliver against now. So yeah, Z clauses have got place. Sometimes they're good and sometimes they're bad.
No,
we
that's
can
excellent.
demonize Z clauses, but I have to say NEC have demonized themselves Z clauses. And my own view is that it's not very helpful to have done that, because you can't take the view that a standard form of contract is just it. It can't answer every scenario, and it shouldn't pretend to. So we have to recognize that a standard form of contract is really helpful. It might get you 50% of the way there, it might get you 95, but it's never going to get you 100% in any scenario. So we have to be prepared to look at that standard form and say, okay, this is the project we've got. This is the form that everybody's decided to use. What do we need to do to make this form work? What are the peculiarities of this project? What are the interesting bits of this project where we're going to need to do some extra writing, extra measurement, different forms of inspections, how you're going to measure defects, how long you're going to hold retention for, all sorts of stuff. It really pertains, and that's the bit that makes contracts the very special, beautiful vehicle in many ways that they can be, if people are allowed to come in and support that really holistically, and not from a purely risk averse legal academic background.
Yeah, no, and I 100% agree with you, because, and Val says, I say this every episode, so drum roll, but a project is a unique endeavor with a definite start and a definite end. So you can't just take something stock standard and make it work.
Absolutely. But we know also the real life bit means that we cannot start with purity each time. We have to start with a standard form or something that we've used before to give us that leg up and that heave ho forward. And there's never enough time to do a job properly anyway, let alone if you have to start with a blank sheet of paper. You asked me about an interesting Z clause. I'll tell you something I have come across which is really interesting, and it shows whether people do a good contract review or not, and that is hidden clauses which are nonsense. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of this, or any of the listeners will do when they read this as well. Particularly on very big fat contracts, you often find a couple of nonsense clauses in there. There's one I've come across a couple of times actually, and I think it must have emanated from the same source. I don't know who, genuinely, and it has as part of the scope a requirement for the named project manager to be brought bacon and egg sandwiches every day at 7 o'clock in the morning. With a little pot of ketchup and a little pot of brown sauce and a cup of tea and a round of toast, and a glass of orange juice and all this other stuff.
That is awesome.
But it's subtle enough, and it's written in exactly the same format with all the right numbering, everything follows. If you weren't reading it properly, you would never find this thing. And of course you'd sign up to it, and then at some point somebody would discover it and you'd all agree it's a bit of nonsense and you'd cross it out, because that's the real life bit. But it's incumbent on us as advisors to make sure that we do read this stuff for people and flag it up with a big smiley face and go, no.
Is that real?
Yeah. Can I have it as a cost component, is my standard reply back.
Dale, we should put that in our contracts from now on. Just make sure.
I'll do it for you as a freebie after this session.
There we go.
You can have it in your retainer or your release form.
Yeah,
bacon and eggs.
We'll do that. Let me just comment one more thing, Val, just before I hand to you. I was intrigued because you have this notion of, okay, you've got your commercial team, and we've spoken about you have, potentially people, or you should have people that know contract law and that are able to administer the contract. But then you have times where you go to in-house legal counsel. When is the right time to go to legal counsel? Because for some companies, it's like all the time we have to make sure that, we're okay. But then others, it's a bit more like, okay, that's only when we're in shit.
Well, it comes back to that firefighting point that Val mentioned, isn't it? Where do you start when the entire building is aflame? The answer is the children, obviously, then the Rolls Royce. In my view and in my experience, and again, in each of the three sort of parts of my career, it's been different. As a private practice lawyer, nobody ever comes to you soon enough, because as soon as they ring you up, you start the clock ticking, because that's your fees, because you're working for a commercial organization that has to earn squillions to have nice offices and shiny toys and all the rest of it. When you're in-house, it's almost the opposite. It's like you're a cost head anyway, and this is the way I've always looked at it. I'm a cost head to a business. I need to earn my keep. I need to show I'm valuable. I need to show I'm wanted. I need to show I'm useful, which is why I go out there with my hard hat and my boots and I say, how can I help you? I do understand contracts. Are you stuck on anything? What are your sticky comp events? What's been hanging around has been difficult to resolve. And of course, if you can get a feel for that, and I'd really like to become part of the project team in that way, just another person on the team, lending their expertise as everybody else does on the team with their technical, risk, commercial, whatever else expertise. And that is the real value in a way in being able to offer up services as a legal advisor. And it's a real privilege to be able to do so, because there are licenses and laws and ethical codes and all sorts of stuff that attach to being in that role. And there are privileges, including legal privilege as a concept, which attaches to someone who is in that position. And having the ability to give a client privilege over their documentation is a privilege in itself. So that gets a bit circular, sort of down the sinkhole. But yeah, the idea of when's the best time to come, it is definitely as early as you feel you should, because when the referral paper hits your desk, it's too late. You can get all your hoses out and start spraying the water everywhere and hoping for the best, and you might dampen a couple here and there, but actually there's going to be one which is just smoldering away, which is just going to go like that before you realize it. Just to follow your fire analogy. Not sure how well it's going, but anyway, I'll keep plugging away at it for a while. But actually you can help more with the fire preventative measures, by helping them to get the contract right, by giving a steer and a guidance here and there, by writing a template notice or a letter which then somebody can use themselves, educate themselves about, reproduce it, then they can do it and run with it themselves, and that's a real joy to be able to do. And that again is a privilege of the position. So it's never early enough, but then I know project controls people and planners who would say the same thing. So having foresight about this stuff is
that is
ideal,
true,
but not true.
We never get timing is a critical element on most projects, and we always, in hindsight, we're like, should have done that earlier.
Yeah.
But I want to jump into the kind of experiential part of your role, because you've obviously been on a lot of projects, you've experienced and seen a lot of things. And one thing I've noticed on projects when things don't go right is the circle of trust gets very small. And I wanted to know from your experience, and you don't have to name names, but some projects where there's been a lot of conflict, and kind of what was the scenario and how did you resolve that conflict? I mean, conflict from a performance perspective, or maybe it's between the client and the contractor in terms of progress or litigation or anything else like that. Have you got some juicy stories for us?
Oh God, there's so many. I should write a book one day. Yeah, I mean, it goes from the sublime to the ridiculous in some senses, because you get very tiny things that niggle people, and as you say, that trust, as soon as it starts to crack and to ebb away, life becomes very difficult. Small projects, big projects, and everything in between. I mean, I've been involved in some very large hundreds of millions of pounds contracts which have had delivery problems all the way through. Nothing particular, and then sometimes something very particular, properly professionally negligent designs and things that just don't work. You get the train on the test track and it just doesn't go round, and you think, how the hell have we got to this point? Let's deconstruct the whole thing back into pieces, put it all back together again and see what happens. So there's those very kind of big ones, and I suppose those are big juicy ones in some ways, but they're often unsatisfactory ones because they've gone too far in the wrong direction, such that you can't get them back, rectify it, and then of course produce a train that does go around the tracks. Gosh, there've been so many over the years. I don't know what to point to. I had a really interesting one actually. Oh, here's one. Probably about 15 years ago now, involving the building of a new embassy. So government was a client, I can say that much. Somewhere where the UK government didn't really trust it, but needed an embassy. got to be one of those countries where you have an embassy, that sort of thing, but don't really like the people there, what they do, how they conduct themselves, or anything else, frankly. So yeah, there's a handful of places in the world that fall into that category, probably more nowadays.
North Korea. No.
It wasn't, but there are some parallels, I have to say.
Saudi. There you go.
I didn't get to. Okay, stop. I didn't get to do a site visit, and I probably wouldn't have done one anyway. There's another clue. But yeah, anyway, that one was really interesting because this whole thing had been built. There was loads of stuff in the contract because of a mistrust from the off, and it was fine because everybody mistrusted everybody. So to some extent, there was trust about the agreement of mistrust. Really, difficult stuff. And what happened towards the end of the build, when the whole thing had first fix, second fix, was being kitted out, pretty pictures, paint on the walls, the whole thing, was that somebody discovered a bug in the wall of one of this massive parts of the embassy. And
so
you
when
can
you mean
imagine
a bug, you mean
a security
listening
bug.
device?
A listening device.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Ooh,
Yeah, really, fascinating for a junior lawyer at the time, working with a very senior
that's exciting. Yeah.
lawyer. Very, very interesting, exciting, but all hell broke loose, as you can probably imagine, over at 10 Downing Street and all the rest of it. And of course, what do you actually do? Again, law tells you one thing: this thing hasn't been built properly, we're not going to pay you, there's defects, all of this stuff, claims, insurance, all of that. But what do we do with this great big thing, which for all we know could just have this one tiny rogue bug in it? Lots of day labor, lots of incomplete cards, and of course technology's moved on in terms of traceability and certificates and security passes and all that kind of stuff. But putting that aside, is there one of these things, or are there 1,000 of these things? It's this massive complex. And what do you do? So we get this expert in, and whole expert team actually in the end, and they have to start doing test holes. So this whole building becomes punctured with holes to try and discover and find out
Oh my God.
if there's any more of these things. And it is as random as you like. I saw drawings for where they were going to do them, and then of course the post exercise drawings as well, mapped on top, CAD style, this is where we did them, this is what X marks the spot, all of this. And you've got this building which in the meantime is punctured in 1,000 places, but the upshot of it is you still got this thing which is standing there, which the client doesn't want. What are you going to do? You may as well just detonate it and start again, except that it's cost £500 million and all the rest of it. There's people waiting to move in, there's dependencies for visas, there's all sorts of human impact and other project impact, and of course the local traders and contractors that were then going to come in and do decorating and furniture and all this kind of stuff. And HM government is literally there trying to light the fuse and say, no, we're just going to start again. And in the end, it was a relatively happy ending, but they did a really, really thorough, the whole thing looked like a bloody Swiss cheese, honestly, by the end of it. I left the firm, but by the time I left, I don't think they really knew. I think they thought they knew, but I know that the partner I was working with wasn't convinced that they really knew that they'd found all these things. So who knows, perhaps to this day, there are still listening devices in this particular embassy in a part of the world nobody wants to go to.
It's pretty tense. I imagine that
Really?
the room would have been, and you're not online then. Obviously, that was a face-to-face kind of, and
Yeah. So we're going down to the Foreign Office and talk to them about this and looking at these plans and saying, how has this been found out? How long do we think it's going on? Trying to ask relevant questions, obviously looking in the contract, because HM Grub is that sort of a client that they, what can we do about it? Back in the day, I will emphasize it was 15 years ago, and to some extent attitudes and options for dispute resolution and that have moved on. But ultimately, like I said, the practical outcome of not having paid attention to good contract management and project management and delivery and testing inspections as they went along, so you had this massive Swiss cheese of a thing that nobody wanted to occupy. And what do you do with it?
Yeah. Sarah, I don't know how you did it, but you made contract law exciting again. Well done. For those
Woohoo!
listening, no, that's great. I've got one lead-on question, and I'm going to go to Martin. How much of your job is, just from that story you told, and it's a great story, is kind of literature interpretation, and how much of your job is like family therapy? Is it an equal weighting? Is it mostly behaviors, or is it mostly contracts that cause the most grief and conflict?
I think it's not paying attention to contracts. I think it's a mixture of complacency, of arrogance in some places, and of lack of education to enable and to empower. And I sort of dislike the words, but to empower in a positive sense, project managers to be able to get to grips with and to really drive in a confident way the projects that they're being asked to deliver. So it's a funny one. It's sort of like sticking your head in the sand and doing it the way you've always done it, because you're sort of okay with that. You know, it's not great, but it'll do, and it works most of the time. So you get on with it like that. There's definitely an element of family therapy in there, and I do, when I'm on projects, I do like to think of the project team I'm working with as a sort of a family, although one never gets too close because one's in a professional capacity. But certainly, project woes come to me probably sooner than other people in project teams. And part of that, again, is the privilege of being an independent advisor, of having the ability to take in some of that stuff and to give a genuinely objective opinion on what should be done next, and how things might be able to be improved or what have you going forward. It certainly can be quite difficult, and people confide in you and tell you all sorts of interesting and juicy stuff, and then you have to get on the phone with the subject matter of the prior conversation. You're thinking, how's this going to work? But it's a thing that you just learn how to do, and you have to do it in order to be in that very privileged position of being a trusted advisor. Perhaps family therapy will be my next career when I've had enough of this.
Nice transition. Yeah,
Thank
definitely.
you.
Martin, get in there.
Yeah, just kind of following on from that, we mentioned at the start of the podcast about how the contract forms the relationship between the two parties, and kind of following on from what you just said there around my questions around transparency. We have certain types of contract that promote transparency, your option Cs, Ds. I'm sure there's plenty of other forms around the world, but often businesses may not want to be transparent when there's an issue, that when they're liable for something, potentially using your example in the embassy there, they may not want to share that with their client. Probably don't. How do you generally advise businesses to get around this? Do you recommend being upfront, get it out on the table, work to a solution? But obviously there's profitability implications. Like what's your experience on this? And
well, again, going back to that independence and that trusted advisor bit, it's a duty and as well as a right. And of course, your clients come to you because they want your advice, but it's also a duty in terms of giving them straight up what their situation looks like in the eyes of the law. Because ultimately, as I said, it's going to be a call to a tribunal that's going to determine what the answer is, what the legally correct answer is to that. Now, nobody really wants to go down that line of stuff, but your clients have to know what could be on the horizon for them if they don't take certain actions. So, the fact that they come to you with a particular problem is the start of that understanding, that journey bit, if you like. You suggested that some contracts have transparency in them. The C and the D options of NEC do to some extent have transparency in them, but it's a transparency which is demanded and driven only in relation to cost. And it's because of how cost is pegged and weighted and pain and gain and all of that stuff. So the transparency there is very limited, and it has a specific purpose. So if you're asking about transparency more generally as a contract, then of course that would be a great thing for projects to have, wouldn't it? Everybody would benefit from more transparency about progress, about measurement, about budget, about delay, about bugs in embassies, about any sorts of problems. It is incumbent on project parties to raise that. in that arena, then NEC is a helpful form of a contract because it has the early warning thing, which not only encourages but requires. So you've got to have an obligation on parties to be transparent, because as you say, the natural thing is to not be transparent, because you're either a client who doesn't really want to say how much money is in their pocket to spend on this thing that they want, a big shiny thing, but they only want to pay for a sort of unshiny small thing, or you're a contractor who wants to protect their profitability on it, to maybe take some shortcuts. Maybe they're really smart and they've worked out where they can take shortcuts. That's not a problem as far as the contract's concerned, provided it meets the delivery outcomes, meet what is required. Again, cost, quality, time. The quality thing, of course, is a difficult thing, which is why the embassy story is quite an interesting one. The costs, of course, are impactful in that way, because what do you do with that thing that nobody wants? Zero earned value. What do you do about time, and a whole heap of on cost and consequential stuff, which then has to be unraveled as well. I'm generally in favour of transparency, and I'm generally in favour of putting one's case across to your would-be opponent, if you like, to your other contractual party, because I think if you don't do it at that point, when are you going to do it? So if you do it early, and it doesn't have to be as early as possible, it has to be when you are ready, but it has to be genuinely ready, and you've got to be able to put it across. And I say you put it across once, you do it well, you let it have impact, you let it settle, and then you start to have those conversations, say, okay, look, I've put this thing out there, we have this real problem with this thing, you've been ignoring us, or we don't feel you've been very responsive to us, and this is our proposal for how we're going to sort this out. And why wouldn't you do that? Why would you save it up, and kind of go ta-da at the end of the project? There's no point. So again, a contract like NEC is quite useful because it encourages and obliges the parties to engage, to talk, to resolve, to assess, to certify, all those active verbs that we talked about earlier as well. So I'm very much in favour of getting it on the table.
Are there any other standard forms of contract out there that go further than NEC 3, NEC option C for transparency?
Well, NEC isn't the answer to everything.
No.
And one can improve on the drafting of NEC in many respects. There are lots of other forms of contract. People always sort of compare and contrast the JCT form of contract in the UK and talk about, old-fashioned style of contract versus new, modern, funky form of contract. And actually, at the end of the day, the scales fall from their eyes, because you have two forms of commercial contract which are bilateral buy-sell contracts. What's the difference? There's some nice words, there's some good ideas, there's lots of decent processes, etc., etc. But at the end of the day, they're buy-sell contracts. So you come back round to, what's the point of transparency? Well, there's no point unless I'm asked to do it. What am I going to gain from it if I am transparent? Is it going to help me, or actually is it going to come back to bite me on the arse? Because, this is something where I've been too upfront, too quickly, too keen to please the client, and the client goes, oh, that's very nice, thanks very much, we're going to get someone else into to the next one. So yeah, you have to be careful with transparency, but I'm absolutely genuinely and generally in favour of it in most circumstances.
Yeah, it seems just the right thing to do. You sometimes have to use your head on some of these things.
And I tell you something else, and that is that courts and adjudicators and tribunals appreciate that.
Yeah.
So there is a long game to be played, in one sense, with potential disputes, with early warnings and that sort of thing. So doing the right thing does pay dividends, but unfortunately it sometimes only pays dividends when you come in front of a tribunal, which is the ultimate arbiter of your problem, which of course has cost you time and money and stress and everything else to get there, but they'll give you the right answer and they'll give you credit for it. The problem with being too transparent up front, pre any procedure like that, is that you don't get anything for it. The project manager doesn't go, you've been so good, thank you so much for telling us all about this early, of course you can have this, that and the other. They go, oh, thanks for telling us about that, no, you can't have it. and assess it at even less than you'd probably get anyway. So, I'm being slightly flippant with my project manager friends there, but there's a time and a place for transparency, and if it's helpful to the project, then of course you must do it. So I'll stop there.
Absolutely, it's about getting the right balance. Val, I think you got one more question.
I can't help myself. I've just got so many questions for you, Sarah. But I take your point on transparency as well. I think, there's other factors like proprietary information or intellectual assets. If we give away too much, then what's the point? We basically hand it over to the client that'll eventually hand it over to a competitor. And then I think as well from just commentary that when we scope a project, the client gives you the requirements and you scope out a project at a bid stage. Let's talk about big projects. We haven't understood the full scope of the project at bid stage. It's kind of like here's our experience, our capability, our approach. This is what we think you said. And out of 3 contenders, we're probably the closest to what you need. But at the time the client issued that information, even the client didn't know what they wanted. So the contract is built on ambiguous scope. And what ends up happening, from my observations, is we then seal ourselves to this compliancy. And if it goes too detailed, there's no wriggle room. And as you said, with transparency, it actually ends up putting us in a really awkward position. And the first thing to go out the window when there is problems or performance issues is collaboration. It's the first thing to go. It's like, oh, well, we were nice up until a point, but now you're just not meeting our demands on this very difficult, complex project. And there's so many variables to that. And it's really unfair actually on both parties. I think, there's certain egos that enter the room at this point and make it more difficult, I think. And some people relish in the fact that there is conflict. I think some people make a business out of commercially making things awkward when they don't need to be. I've certainly been on projects, and that's why Martin's laughing, because he was there, where I've seen particular personalities actually impact the way projects perform. What do you do about that, where project managers are right and there is a problem, but they're happy to collaborate and they are able to manage the problem, but the senior executives, the decision makers on both sides, just don't seem to get along? Is there a silver bullet that we can offer as advice maybe for those listening?
Well, it is a very invidious position, isn't it, for a project manager who finds themselves stuck between, the ungrateful client and the unwilling contractor, where, the trust has fallen apart. And it's really part of the project manager's role to act as a broker between those parties, to act as an agent in legal terms, certifying and assessing and all that sort of stuff. But also to almost act as that family therapist. And to make sure that those two heads are knocked together, and egos is massively problematic. I don't have the answer to that other than, I'm naturally quite an impatient person, as my partner will attest to. And as a planner, he knows about measuring time. So I do have to make sure that I think really carefully about how I'm going to support that project manager to broker the deal, to bash the heads together if push comes to shove, because it is a really difficult position to be in. Now, of course, the project manager can only do their professional best. They can make an assessment, they can make a certification, they can make a decision, whatever the active verb is that attaches to the problem at hand. They can only do that with the information they've got, and that may be inadequate, it may be patchy, it may be transparent, which is Martin's wish list, or it may be completely opaque, unavailable, and people have put obstacles in the way so that information isn't available to a project manager, and that's a really horrible position to be in. And of course, as a project manager, you feel like you're facing everything and having to deal with the whole lot. We talked about all the verbs that attach, all the different roles that have to be played by a project manager in the NEC form contract, for example. And you just can't do all of that, and no man is an island in that respect. So I like to make sure that my project managers feel supported first off, so they've got me to come to in terms of contract help. Where do I stand? What do I have to do? When do I have to do it? How far can I push this? Yeah, my client is the one who's paying me, but actually that puts me in a really difficult position too, because my client has now turned into this, you're in my pocket type of personality, which happens horribly quickly sometimes in these scenarios, which just, spiral downwards down the sink. And suddenly you get this sort of jostling for position where the client is asserting itself and saying, again, we talked about contracteers, didn't we? It's my project. Yeah. You're my contractor, you're my project manager, and all this sort of stuff. And that's really hard because you're looking at that, and that's a single human in that position. So first off, it's a question of support, family therapy support, but contract practical support to help that project manager know where they stand and what they can do. And of course, then they've got to have the guts to do some of the reporting, which the client isn't going to like, which the contractor may not like either, which probably nobody's going to like, but this will like it, because you've done the right thing, you've done the professional thing, you've supported your company, whether it's your own, whether you're a freelancer, or whether you're in a big household name type of a company. You have to do the right thing professionally. That of course impacts then on ethics and codes of conduct, accreditations, professional negligence and professional indemnity insurance, and all the things that go with that. So it is really incumbent on project managers to look after themselves at that moment, both as individuals and as employees, as well as to try and do their best to project manage the parties through whatever that difficulty is. Of course, the ultimate thing is that you have to say, I can't do this anymore, and reluctantly walk away with your head held high. But that is a real thing, and if push comes to shove, that's what project manager has to do. But of course, you don't advise somebody to do that readily. You try and help them through it. And blood may be spilled when heads are bashed, but the concussion may come out with a different outcome, and people can move on. Not easy though, very invidious.
Exactly. That's right. It's exactly what I did, Sarah. I walked away. No, I didn't. I have a question, more just generalistic. And if there's anything we can help, by the way, you mentioned the not-for-profit and the APM SIG. If Project Chatter can get involved, we'd love to help. We try and enhance and amplify any good deeds, any paying it forward for the project community. Is there any free resources or like an anonymous helpline for project managers that are having contract difficulties, and just someone they can talk to? Sometimes they're just locked in these commercial reviews for like 9-10 hours. They get out. Everyone says commercial refresh, and if I ever hear that again, I'm going to cry. But is there anywhere people can go in? They just download it. Is there an app? Contract law, common law. How do we get people educated on this subject matter?
Oh gosh, if I had enough time to do all of those things, I would have definitely embarked on at least half of them by now. All of them are fantastic ideas. There is no help for poor old project managers. I mean, there is, in the sense that you can, there is a helpline from the APM and from PMI for project managers to get to ask for help. And there are groups on LinkedIn and all this sort of stuff, but you have to be a little bit careful, because you can't get into specifics sometimes. You're putting that information out to the world, you're going to be subject to confidentiality clauses and things like that, so that can get a bit tricky. So the kind of whistleblowing anonymous citizens advice bureau type of thing is what project managers need. But no, I can't supply that, but I would love to be able to get involved.
Any of our listeners that are out there, they might be inspired, Sarah, by this conversation, getting exciting about contract law, or maybe even a WikiLeaks page. Not that I'm promoting that. I'm just saying, feel free. Hell over to you.
Yeah, no, I love it. It's great. I just wanted to comment on the Swiss cheese, and I got all geeky because Martin mentioned earned value and everything. Like, I was like, okay, well, if you get the Swiss cheese building and you have to then load up, you can't unearn, because you're quite strict with earned value, and you can't unearn, and then maybe you would because it's a rebase. Anyway, I just thought I'd comment on that because I got all geeky, and it's got nothing to do with contract law. But we do.
No, but you can build that in, of course, if you want to. If you want to have that as a measurement tool, if that's going to be useful.
Yeah. So well, this is the thing.
Especially if it's future stuff.
A lot. There are very few that I've worked with, but where actual contract payments are based on earned value. And I think it's a fantastic mechanism if you can get that in place, but very few actually take advantage of it. But
No,
maybe for
nobody
another
likes that.
podcast.
Nobody likes that. Nobody would do any work, would they? Because when do you measure the value of what's been built? To building brick walls, the easy example, isn't it?
Yeah.
You've got to lay 1,000 bricks in order to make a wall. You've put 800 in. Is the wall any good? You don't get the value from the wall until it's 1,000 high. And how long's that going to take? And who's going to do the work? And who's going to fund it in the meantime? So, I love fund value. It's got loads of useful stuff, but you got to have reliable data. You've got to know what you're building and measuring, and you're not going to be able to peg it to contract payments. There's not a chance, especially with longevity and legacy stuff, coming into it.
Yeah.
How many people are still using the Olympic swimming pool? If I was paid on that basis, you'd be wanting a very large kind of, payment profile in your contract, because you're not going to be paid for years after. So you've got to build up, load up that question too. And that comes back to taxpayer value for money and all sorts of other stuff. So your project's going to cost more if you want to do that, because effectively you're asking me to front load your
but
your project.
And perhaps we might have a bit more transparency and less risk as well. And so inevitably, although it might cost more upfront, it might cost less in the long run. I don't know. It's another podcast.
I think it would. Yeah, let's do part 2. Come back with some numbers and some pictures.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But, yeah, it'd be great. But on that note, I mean, we went down this rabbit hole of contract law, and we stayed down this rabbit hole. And I know there's so many other angles that we could speak about when it comes to law. I know we are a bit limited on time with you because it is late and we don't want to keep you, the whole night. But we do also want to move on to the feature. And this is, I mean, we talk about, you making law exciting and fun again. And this is a bit of fun as well, where Martin takes our guests through the paces and puts our guest in the hot seat.
Okay.
So Martin, over to you. What are you going to put Sarah through?
This is our guest feature called Defend the Indefensible. It's where we invite our guests to defend a ridiculous statement for 30 seconds. It's inspired by some of the ridiculous statements we've heard over the course of our careers.
Okay.
So if you're ready for this.
I wish I had a cold towel, then I'd be ready. Okay, go on, hit me.
Guinness Zero.
Hit me, yes, boy.
Okay, Sarah. You have 30 seconds to defend the following statement. Most projects are successful until commercials are involved. Discuss.
Gosh, well, let's not have commercials involved in projects at all, and then we won't have any issue about project success whatsoever. Stick with contract lawyers. We know our stuff. We can support project managers. Project managers know their stuff, and if they trust us, off we go. I'm not sure if that's 30 seconds yet. It probably doesn't defend anything whatsoever, but it is absolutely indefensible to say that commercial people are useless to projects.
Short and sweet. Very good.
Very good.
Ooh,
Thank you.
I've
Before we
missed
go,
that bit in prior podcasts that I'd listened to. That was very exciting. Thank you for doing that.
Before you go, we've got time for one more feature. It's called Fiverr. 5 quick fire questions, all about yourself. So if you're ready, let's make a start. Okay, number 1. Would you rather spend your day with people or technology?
People.
What's more important, time, cost, or quality?
Quality.
It's a consistent theme there. Number 3, what book would you recommend to our subscribers?
Anything by Isabel Allende, because it looks at the history of South America, the politics and the social side of life.
What will be your nice. What will be your new work routine? Office, home, or hybrid?
I've been at home for about 8 years now, so perhaps a little more office and a little more hybrid.
Wow, interesting. Last one. What was your biggest mistake on a project?
Not getting involved and bullying my way into it early enough.
Very good. Thanks a lot.
Awesome.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's been a fascinating podcast, and we always knew it would be. Before we even hit record, we had loads of fun just, catching up and sort of just delving into where we might go with this episode. But I didn't know it would take us the way it did, and it's been so insightful. I've learned a hell of a lot. So thank you. And I'm sure all the listeners will as well. We'll post the links to the webinar, as you mentioned. We'll get those from you, and we'll post those in the show notes. And also, I just want to say a big shout out to Christine Stone, because Christine, mentioned we should get in touch with you. And she was 100% correct again that, you are amazing. And so thank you for giving up your time and sharing your insights and thoughts. Before we let you go, any final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with?
Oh, just that it's been a really fun session, and I'm so happy to have the opportunity to be enthusiastic from my heart about contracts, and to hopefully give project managers a bit more of support in being able to do their jobs, and to maybe encourage them to have a bit more of a voice to speak up, because they're doing an incredible job under often very difficult circumstances. So I'm right with you guys and girls, and do let us know if we can help with anything.
Fantastic. And we'll take up your offer and get you back for a follow-up part 2 at some stage in the future. Val, any final thoughts from you?
Oh, Sarah, you've brought excitement back to my life in the contract law space. Enjoy your pizza, and I think
Thank
you
you.
did pass the trifecta today. You gave us, we were raw, we were informal and informative. So I think we did a really great job. But thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you guys for having me. It's been a lot of fun. But I am looking forward to my pizza now.
So without further ado, folks, that is all the time we have. But remember to hit subscribe before you go. A massive thank you once again to our guest, Sarah Schutte. And thank you all for listening. Till next time, we say stay safe, be disruptive, and have fun doing it. From me, Val, and Martin, it's bye for now.